Does a condition like ADHD continue into adulthood? And when does it start? Previously, it was only thought that children had this condition. It was described in 1902 by a pediatrician called George Still, and he's described it in children. And it was a child who famously he described as fidgety Philip. And this is a child who had particular behavioral problems. And of course, these are children that we've recognized over many, many years. Those busy kids, those difficult kids who can't sit still, and they stand out. You know, the older someone gets with ADHD, those impulsive, those busy traits tend to disappear. And the older they get transformed, they get internalized, and they take on a different form. There is actually no age limit to when you can be diagnosed. There is a diagnostic manual called the DSM-5, that's the most recent one we have, and it indicates that you should show these symptoms before the age of 12. And we've got criteria for children, and then we've got criteria which are very similar for adults. And you need less of the criteria because the hyperactivity, on the go as if driven like a motor as a criteria for a child clearly does not apply to adults. But you can be diagnosed at any age. And the smarter the child, the more support they have, the less behavior problems they have, the stricter the school, the better the teacher, the better the school, the more caring the environment, the less symptoms you actually see. So children can present later and later. There's so much more awareness, but there are those that do miss and fall through the net, as it were, and are only diagnosed in adulthood. We almost at a sort of a watershed in a generation when these problems are picked up early. So, you know, there are a lot of parents that get diagnosed indirectly when we assess children. And up to 2/3 of all children with ADHD will continue into adulthood. And what are some of the problems that adults can have with ADHD? You know, a child with ADHD doesn't have a driving license. They're not involved in relationships. They're protected by their parents. They can't go out and use illicit substances. They're not controlling their own money. But as an adult, if those problems are not dealt with early on, you know, the older one gets, we often say in men, these get expressed particularly when they're driving, impulsive driving, road rage, often more accidents, and hyperactivity for girls when they're younger. Hyperactivity can be seen in women by excessive talking. Financial management is a problem for adults. They leave things to the last moments. They can't balance their checkbooks. They don't address things when they should be addressed. And unless they, in relationships with people and spouses that complement those deficiencies, there are huge problems. Now, one of the things we see is that if it's unmanaged, there's almost a 60% chance that girls with ADHD will have a teenage pregnancy. Those with ADHD unmanaged are 2.5 times more likely to get divorced. They are 2.5 times more likely to take illicit substances. They're more likely to smoke, alcohol abuse, gambling. They have addictive properties. There's excellent research that says if you treat this early on, you're going to prevent these addictive tendencies later on. There's this perception that if you're on medication, that it causes addiction. It's complete nonsense. Adults with ADHD in a work environment are difficult people. They don't like to be told what to do. They often make good salespeople, but when they've got to manage other people, they have a lot of difficulty because management of people requires a lot of social skills. They have difficulty with those things. I read an interesting article where they did a review in Europe where they looked at all the women that were in prison and did assessments for ADHD. And something like 80% of women in prison in Europe can be diagnosed with ADHD. Adults with ADHD that are not treated, unfortunately, are involved with high-risk activities. They involve in high-risk behaviors. They have reduced life expectancy if it's untreated. They have early death. They don't think about the future. They don't care about their health. And a very sobering fact about ADHD in adulthood is that in an adult who doesn't have ADHD, who smokes, who has diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, those combined risks are actually less than if you have ADHD as an adult and it's not addressed. It often gets misdiagnosed as anxiety and depression. And these things, unfortunately, have not been instilled in the education of doctors early on. And is not part of their training. It gets missed. That's why myself as a pediatrician focusing on these problems see so many children that have been seen by so many other doctors that often gets missed. And you know, ADHD can be treated at any age.